Hi, my name's Jeffrey Hanson. I'm a senior research scientist at Carleton University. I work in Professor Joe Bennett's research group, and today I'm here to talk to you about the Where to Work tool. So, the Where to Work tool is a program that was developed in collaboration with Carleton University and the Nature Conservancy of Canada, which aims to help conservation practitioners identify priorities for establishing conservation areas and implementing management. So this tool is something that me and a bunch of other people have worked on over the last few years, and I'm excited today to tell you about some of the concepts and principles that underpin this tool to help ensure that when you're using this tool, that it actually gives you the correct or useful answers. Um, so, as I'm sure you're aware, over the last few decades, biodiversity has been declining, and at this point in time, we have a range of options available to us. So if we continue on as business as usual, biodiversity will continue to decline, which is not something that we really want. And that's kind of shown by the grey scenario down the bottom, where you can see there's fewer numbers of species and, fewer trees, less habitats available. Alternatively, we could implement some increased conservation efforts, and this might halt the declines of biodiversity, as shown by the orange scenario. And so here you can see the orange scenario has a few more trees and a few more species in it. But ideally, what we'd want to do is we'd want to halt and reverse these declines, as shown by the green scenario. And there you can see that there's many more species and many more trees. And what's critical here is that the trend isn't just stabilizing; it's also increasing back up as well. And that's what we really want for positive outcomes for biodiversity. But how do we achieve this? And this is tricky because there's lots of different things you can potentially do to try and promote biodiversity. And this makes it really hard to make decisions about what to do in order to promote and recover biodiversity. This is because, and so this is complicated because there's many options available. And conservation is fundamentally about implementing actions in places. So, whether that's establishing conserved areas, doing invasive species management, doing restoration, these are all different types of actions that are available and they're implemented in particular places. And when we try to make decisions about what actions to implement in which places, we need to think about lots of things. We need to think about the fact that there are many facets of biodiversity that are available and need attention. So that might be different species, different types of habitats, or different ecosystem services like carbon sequestration or water purification. There's also limited resources that are available for implementing conservation actions. And what this means is it's not always feasible to implement the most effective potential set of actions. And there's a need to prioritize specifically which actions would be implemented in which places because it wouldn't be feasible to manage everywhere for biodiversity. There's also uncertainty with the possible outcomes associated with implementing these actions. And what that means is if we're trying to prioritize places for implementing actions, we don't necessarily know if we implement action A, what the potential outcome would be versus, well, we might have some idea, but we would have uncertainty. So we don't necessarily know if we do invasive species management in this area, are we going to have, a 10% or a 20% reduction of invasive species, or is it going to be more like 80%? Now, with some actions, we might have a greater uncertainty, and others we might have lesser uncertainty. But there's a need to account for this uncertainty. There's also the fact that we need to identify compromises that are suitable for a range of different stakeholders. For example, in terrestrial systems, when you're developing plans for conservation areas, you might also need to consider how those areas might be used for agriculture or be required for urban planning. And similarly, in marine areas, if you're developing marine protected areas, you might need to consider the interests of commercial and recreational fisheries. Um, and so, what that means is, in order to develop an effective conservation plan, you need to consider lots of different potential viewpoints and stakeholder values in order to generate a plan that's going to be satisfactory for lots of different people. So, to help navigate this kind of difficult decision space, the framework called systematic conservation planning has been developed. This has been around for over 50 years and it's been used in many places throughout the world. Here are some really notable examples. So it's been used to help manage the Great Barrier Reef in Australia, develop marine protected areas in the Gulf of California and Mexico, and also develop protected areas in Finland. So, the Systematic Conservation Planning Framework, or SCP, is a framework for evaluating ongoing management. So, that's things like evaluating how good existing protected areas might be, or evaluating how good various different management actions might be. It's a framework for prioritizing new actions, so identifying where you would want to establish new conservation areas, or potentially a better way to manage existing protected areas, and also to monitor their effectiveness as well. And this framework has 11 different steps in it. And I'm just going to go over each of these steps briefly. So the first step is scoping and costing the planning process. And this is a really important step because completing the entire framework can be very time consuming and require a lot of resources. And so that means if you're going to undertake this, you really want to make sure that you can see it through to the end. But you also want to understand, what kind of, what's the scope of this kind of thing, so what's the area that's being considered, what kind of people might be relevant. And so that's more in step 2, which is identifying and involving stakeholders. So this would be the step where you find all the people that might be interested, might have, it might be impacted by the conservation plan or might be interested in seeing it succeed. So this could be things like local NGOs, governmental organizations, or landowners, or commercial industries that are operating in the area. And ideally, these stakeholders should be involved as early as possible because they're going to play a big role in shaping how the rest of this framework is implemented. The third step is describing the context for the conservation areas. So this is really important because this is understanding what's the decision-making context. So is this framework, is this particular exercise being implemented to try and identify protected areas, or is it looking at land acquisition, trying to guide land acquisition for a land trust, for example, or is it looking at establishing marine protected areas? And so deciding on what the decision context is really important because that influences, things like who the decision maker is and making sure that the way that the planning process proceeds is going to be able to fit within, the reality of where this kind of exercise is taking place. The fourth step is identifying fundamental objectives, and these fundamental objectives are really important. They're the aspirational goals that you have for why you would implement these conservation areas or management actions. So a good example of a fundamental objective might be to conserve threatened species or threatened ecosystems, or it might be to promote the provisioning of ecosystem services, or it could be promoting sustainable livelihoods. And so it's really important with these fundamental objectives that they relate to things that you want to happen. So, for example, and they underpin why you are doing this kind of planning process in terms of what you want to achieve with it. So, for example, a thing that is not a fundamental objective would be we want to establish protected areas, or we want to create new protected areas. Like that's a kind of self-serving circular kind of reasoning, because if you just want to establish protected areas, you could just put them randomly. You don't necessarily need to consider anything else because nothing else would be relevant than just meeting a random threshold area size kind of thing. So what I'm trying to say is with fundamental objectives, they relate to the things that you're trying to achieve by implementing the conservation areas or the management actions. And it's really important that the stakeholders are involved with setting these fundamental objectives, so that way everybody's on board with what the kind of key considerations are during this planning process. The next steps in 5 and 6 relate to data collection. So here you want to collect or gather or obtain, from in the field or from online resources or from published studies, data on things like socioeconomic variables and threats. And this will be really important for understanding how the biodiversity in the areas, in the landscape or the seascape that you're working in, are impacted by threatening processes. And also the socioeconomic variables are really important because that can potentially help understand trade-offs between the planning process, establishing new protected areas and other stakeholder values like agriculture or urban planning and that kind of stuff. With step 6, you want to collect data on biodiversity and other natural features, and that's really important so you can have an understanding of where different species or habitats are in the landscape, which of course will be really important for determining where you would want to establish new protected areas. At step 7, you would set conservation goals and targets. And these are quantitative. So the fundamental objectives are more like aspirational kind of goals. They don't necessarily have any numbers or specific criteria to them. But at step 7, we're setting conservation goals and targets, and this is where things get a bit more quantitative, because we're going to be setting goals or targets that relate to specific things that you've got data on. So, for example, you might have data on a threatened species, and you might set a goal that is, we want to protect 90% of the known habitats for this threatened species because it's a particularly threatened species. Or you might have a goal that's, we want to protect 2 hectares of habitat for this particular plant species. And critically, you would set goals and targets based on the things you have data for. And so it's really important that you've got data for things that relate to your fundamental objectives. Otherwise, you can't set goals for them, at this step in the framework. At step 8, this is where you review the achievement of the objectives. And so what this means is you then obtain data on existing management practices or existing conservation areas. And then you see how will the existing areas compare in terms of meeting your goals and targets that you set in step 7. So you might say, we've got a target that we want to get 90% of the habitat for this threatened species, but our existing conservation areas are only getting 20%. And so there's actually quite a large shortfall there. So there's more room to improve. But you might find if you've got another target, or goal that we want to get, 100% of another species distribution inside the landscape, and existing protected areas already fully cover that, then that goal or target is already met. And so that could, that's quite good because you've met the target. So there's potentially other considerations other things you'd want to think about when deciding where to put your new kind of priority areas. At step 9, this is the step about selecting priority areas for conservation or generating a prioritization. So the idea here is coming up with a plan of which new places or actions you're going to be implementing in order to improve the current system or set of actions that are being implemented so that they can meet all of the objectives or goals. At step 10, this is where you implement these conservation actions, or which might be establishing protected areas in the selected areas. And then at step 11, that's maintaining and monitoring conservation areas. So this is after you've implemented them. You then want to make sure that they're being implemented successfully and monitor to see whether you're actually achieving those your goals and targets, and ultimately your overall fundamental objectives. And the reason that this is really important is due to uncertainty. So there might be uncertainty in where a threatened species is found. And so even though you've developed an optimal conservation plan for trying to protect habitats for a range of species, including a particular threatened species, if there's uncertainty in where that species is found, then it might mean that after you've implemented your new management actions and you've established your new conservation areas, that you're still not actually doing a good job at protecting the species, because some of the places where you thought it was, when creating your plan, it's actually not really there. Or maybe, you were looking at management actions for threatened species, and you thought that initially that invasive species management was going to be really effective at increasing population size. And so based on that assumption, you've completed the analyses and you've prioritized and then implemented, invasive species management in certain areas, but you've found that the population size for the species that you're interested in protecting aren't bounding back after you've implemented these invasive species management measures. So in that case, you might want to revisit that. And so that's a really important point, is this process isn't necessarily completed in a step 1, 2, 3, 4. Often when you're doing this process, you'll be revisiting previous steps as new information or things come to light. And that's really important because, you might find that you've missed out at a fundamental objective when you're you've missed out something in step 4 when you're doing step 7. So that's things to think about. And so overall, SCP is really good because it's objective driven. So it's going to help you get what you want rather than necessarily, what the data says. It's stakeholder inclusive because they're involved right at the beginning and have a huge influence at, all the subsequent steps. It's informed by data, as you can see in step 5 and 7. You are obtaining data, and that's going to have an influence on steps 8 and 9, and it's transparent and reproducible. And so the idea here is that steps 8 and 9, when we're identifying our at steps 8 when we're reviewing how well our existing areas are doing, and at step 9 when we're identifying our priority areas, that's going to be based on data and analyses. And so the idea there is that if you repeat those procedures with the same data, you would obtain a similar kind of result. And so the where to work tool, that fits in here at step 9. in the selecting protease for conservation. So what that means is when you want to use the word at work tool, you need to have completed many steps previous to that in order to get the most out of the word at work tool. You'll need to have already collected your data, already set your fundamental objectives, already have an understanding of what your conservation goals and targets are. And so when you have all that ready to go, then the word at work tool can potentially be useful for you. And so systematic conservation planning has been around for a while, and there's been a number of core principles that have been developed to help ensure that the results that people get after they implement this framework are actually useful to them. And so for the rest of this talk, what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be talking about what these principles are. And these principles are largely embedded in the word at work tool, but they also have a role in helping make sure that when you generate prioritizations with the word at work tool, that it gives you priority areas that are useful for meeting your fundamental objectives. So one way to think about these principles is that they help ensure that the conservation goals meet your fundamental objectives. So you might have a fundamental objective related to biodiversity, but actually adequately protecting biodiversity is quite challenging, or even measuring it. And so some of these objectives relate to that. And so because these principles help make sure that your goals and targets relate to your fundamental objectives, that means that if you follow these principles, that helps ensure that steps 8, 9, 10, and 11 are completed successfully. These principles also help with ensuring that priority areas meet your conservation goals. So some of these principles are related to how the selection of priority areas happens in these analyses based on your conservation goals and targets. And by following these principles, you can help ensure that you've identified suitable priority areas, which means when it comes to implementing them at step 10 and then maintaining and monitoring at step 11, that's all happening based on the best available understanding of how this should be done. So I'm going to start off with the principle of connectivity. So this is the idea that connectivity is good. So what is connectivity? Ideally with connectivity, we want to improve, this is about improving the population resilience to disturbance, increasing better population viability, promoting genetic diversity, maintaining energetic pathways among ecosystems. Put simply, it's about promoting individual movements between populations. So for example, we might have one candidate protected area system on the right and one on the left. The one on the right is good, it's got the green tick. The one on the left is bad, it's got the red cross. So why do we like the one on the right more? Well, the reason is because all else being equal, if we want to promote individual movements between populations, we'd want all those populations to be in the same reserve. So in this area, you can see that we've got various populations of different species. We've got a population, three populations of birds, and we've got 6 populations of tigers. So if we want to develop a protected area system that can maintain movements between populations, and we have a fixed certain area that we can protect, we might want to put our protected area, make a really big one around the 2 ones on the left. So that way we can maintain individual movements within the reserve so animals don't have to leave the reserve in order to migrate between populations. So that's called within reserve connectivity, and we also have between reserve connectivity. So within reserve looks at the movements of what's happening with individuals within entire protected areas. Between reserve is thinking about what happens to their movements when they have to leave the reserve and leave a reserve to go to another one. So here we've got a situation where we have some more populations of animals, and we've got the one on the right is a good one with the green tick. The one on the left is a not so good example with the red cross. And in this situation, we have a highway that cuts through part of our study area. So here we can see if we put protected areas in the top left and bottom right parts of the study area, individuals would have to leave the reserve, cross this highway, and then enter the other reserve in order to maintain those movements. And this isn't ideal because highways can serve as a barrier for many species. And so if we want to promote connectivity, we would ideally want our reserves to be configured so that individuals don't have to cross this highway in order to maintain those movements. And so that's why the one example on the right is considered better. And the way that we can account for this in our prioritizations is by using a variety of different data. So we can use data from animal telemetry to parameterize how individuals move across a landscape. We can also obtain information that describes broad-scale connectivity based on patterns of landscape resistance. So That's the idea that you could create a heat map where each different grid cell corresponds to how difficult it is for animals to move through it, and then you would want to prioritize places that have low resistance values because it's easier for individuals to move through those places, and you'd want to spatially cluster those together. Another approach for accounting connectivity is using spatial fragmentation. So that's the example on the far right, where you can spatially cluster together your priority areas so they form bigger reserves. And then the idea with that is you would get more increased within reserve connectivity. The principle of comprehensiveness this is really important for your fundamental objectives if they're related to biodiversity. So a comprehensive reserve system is one that contains examples of many biodiversity features, where biodiversity features might include species, habitats, or ecological processes. So the idea here is, all else being equal, we would want a reserve system or protected area system that covers many different kinds of species, habitats, or ecological processes. So we've got one example at the top, which is the good example, and one on the bottom, which is the bad example. As we can see here in the top example, we have a protected area that captures 4 different species: the bird, the frog, the tiger, and the turtle. In the bottom example, we've got 4 populations of species, but they're all the same species. So we've got 4 populations of turtles. So under the principle of comprehensiveness, we would prefer the top example because that captures more species. Now, these species don't necessarily have to be located all in the same reserve. For example, we could have 2 different reserves in the top example that each capture 2 species in each, so you get 4 species in total still. But the idea is overall, you would be getting more species there. And the way that you account for comprehensiveness is by getting a lot of data on different species, habitat types, and ecosystem services. So this is one example where a paper looked at global prioritization using data on amphibians, mammals, birds, reptiles, plants, water provisioning, and carbon sequestration. The principle of adequacy is that when you're setting your conservation goals, they should ideally ensure the persistence of each feature. So remembering that a feature is like a different species or habitat type, the idea here is when you're setting your conservation goals, that they should be based on the minimum amount needed for that species or habitat type to persist into the future. And so what that means is, you might have to talk to some experts or stakeholders or run some analyses in order to get a good idea on what those goals should be. But let's say, for example, in this example, that you talk to an expert and they said you need to have at least 3 populations of a bird species, of this particular bird species, in order for it to persist. So what that means is the top example would be preferable over the bottom example, because in the top we're getting those 3 populations. We're getting at least 3 populations. If we had 4, that'd be even better, but it's not necessary. Whereas we need at least 3. In the bottom example, we've only got one population protected, so that's not going to meet our goal. Or rather, if we set a goal based on only obtaining 1 population, then that wouldn't be enough in order to ensure the persistence. And the way that we account for adequacy is by setting good goals. So these goals refer to the minimum required coverage of each biodiversity feature, so species or habitat. These can be based on policies. So for example, one common approach is setting goals based on percentages in international policies like the Global Biodiversity Framework, or formerly the Aichi targets. Another approach is using statistical models. So you can use things like population viability analyses to identify the minimum area or population sizes needed for species to persist. This is a gold standard approach, and in practice isn't really widely used, just because running these kinds of analyses requires a lot of data that often isn't available over the large kind of spatial scales people are working with when they do conservation planning. But it's still worth thinking about if these kinds of analyses are available, because if they are, then you've got a really good way of setting goals. The third approach is using expert thresholds or expert information to set the goals. So one approach might be to set goals based on minimum habitat requirements according to national or international threat list classification systems. So for example, you could set thresholds based on the minimum amount of habitat needed for species to qualify as least concern on the IUCN Red List. Or you could implement other kinds of thresholds based on national threat classification systems, such as the New Zealand Threat Classification System, or NZTCS. In addition to setting good goals, it's also really important that we have good data, because we might set a really good goal, but if the data we're using to assess if that goal is being met or not is rubbish, then it's not really as useful having that really, we might have a great goal, but we don't really have any idea if we're meeting it or not when we're reviewing our existing reserves or when we're prioritizing new areas for conservation protection. So examples of data that you could use for species include area of habitat data or species distribution models or models of species abundance. For habitat types, you can use things like habitat classification systems, and these are readily available across the world, usually. The principle of representativeness, this relates to the hierarchical nature of biodiversity. You could think about the principle of comprehensiveness as relating to the kind of width of biodiversity, so the range of different things that are available at a given level, but representativeness is about capturing different levels. So with representativeness, you want to sample all the full levels. So by levels, I mean things like biomes, ecosystem types, habitat types, species, subspecies, genetic variation. And so comprehensiveness is about, making sure you sample lots of things across each of those levels, but representativeness is about making sure you capture things at each of those different levels. And so, for example, here we've got a system where we might have two alternate solutions. One is where we could capture a range of different habitat types and a range of different subspecies in the top. And in the bottom, we're only getting one of those habitat types and only a subset of those species. So here we're missing out on the habitat level and only considering the subspecies level. In practice, representativeness is quite difficult to achieve. In theory, you would want to have data on ecosystems, data on species, data on genetic variation within those species. In practice, genetic data is rarely available, so most people will use data that's available on species or ecosystems or biomes. The principle of efficiency is the idea that all else being equal, it would be preferable if a reserve system or conservation plan was cheaper and was not too expensive. And the reason for this is, one, if this conservation plan is happening in an area where there are many different stakeholders, and some of these stakeholders have values that relate to alternate land uses like agriculture or urban planning, if the conservation plan overlaps too much and competes too much with those stakeholders' interests, it's less likely that this conservation plan would be successfully implemented and everyone would be happy with it. The second option is that if you're dealing with a conservation plan for an NGO or a land trust, you would ideally want to spend resources as efficiently as possible so you can get the biggest bang for your buck. So in other words, we don't want to waste the money that we have. So that's why the principle of efficiency is quite important. And you'll note that it doesn't actually relate necessarily to the biodiversity. It's about considering how costly is a conservation plan or what impacts would it have on non-conservation related interests. And so in this example, we've got a situation where we've got two alternate conservation plans, one on the top, one on the bottom. The one on the top is only going to cost us one sack of cash because maybe it's a smaller area, and the one on the bottom has a larger area and might require 4 sacks of cash in order to, 4 cost units in order to achieve a similar outcome. And we can see that they both achieve a similar outcome because both of these alternate plans, they both only have one bird and one tiger in them. And the way that we account for efficiency is by getting good cost or weight data. And so the idea here is you can get data so that you can understand, how much does it cost to acquire or manage land or ocean areas for your management actions or your conservation area establishment. So you can use that using things like land value assessment data, data on human pressure, based on the idea that areas with high human pressure are going to be more difficult to implement conservation areas in. And if you've got stakeholders that are directly from commercial industries, say commercial fisheries, you can use opportunity cost data to understand if we were to establish a conservation area here, how much would that negatively impact this stakeholder? And so you could do similar kinds of opportunity cost layers for urban development or recreational fishing and that kind of stuff. The principle of complementarity. Now, this is a really, really important one. This is the idea that protected areas should complement each other, and we want to maximize the overall performance of the protected area network, accounting for existing protected areas. So, for example, let's say you're in charge of managing this area. You've got two alternate plans that someone's presented to you. You've already got two existing protected areas here in this place, shown in green. You've already protected two populations of this bird species and four populations of the tiger. And you're trying to decide, am I going to protect the area on the left or the area on the right? Now we can see the area on the left, that's got a bunch of, it's got a bird, two turtles, so it's got two birds, two turtles, and a tiger, whereas the area on the right, that's got one frog and one turtle. Now, if we had previously talked to our experts and they said, yep, we're really good in terms of how well we're protecting our tigers and our birds, then what that means is we don't necessarily need to get any more birds or tigers in order to meet our conservation goals. And so based on that information, we'd want to select the area that has the frog and the turtle, because that's going to get us the most, it's going to increase the comprehensiveness of our protected area system, because it's going to get new species that we currently don't have. And this can seem really counterintuitive because, when you're thinking about, what are we going to protect? We might think, well, this place here, this has got four species. Four species is better than two species, so surely we should protect the place with more species if, our fundamental objective is about protecting lots of species. But what we really need to think about is how well our overall protected area system is going to be meeting our goals and targets in relation to our fundamental objectives. And so what that means is if our existing protected area system is already meeting our goals and targets for our birds and tigers, then we don't necessarily need to get any more of them to improve in order to meet those, because we've already met them. And so what that means is we'd want to consider this, the protected area, putting that in the place where we get the turtle and the frog, because that's going to help us meet our goals and targets more so. So that's really important. So just because a place might seem, intrinsically more valuable because it has higher species richness or higher species diversity, doesn't necessarily mean it's a higher conservation priority, because it's not. If you're just looking at those numbers, you're not thinking about how well do my existing conservation areas perform and what is this adding to what I've already got. And that's really what you want to be thinking about. So how do we account for complementarity? One way is to get good data on where existing conservation areas are and where existing conservation measures are happening. So you can obtain data on where protected areas are currently, data on Indigenous lands. You can also get data on different kinds of reserve systems. So you might have some places that are managed as no-take marine reserves, and that might be really beneficial. You might also want to think about OECMs and areas that are managed that not necessarily managed in a way that is designed to benefit biodiversity, but still provides biodiversity outcomes nonetheless. So, for example, you might have areas that are sustainably managed for agriculture, and even though their primary objective is to fulfill agricultural needs, they still provide some positive outcomes for biodiversity, and you would want to account for that in your analyses, because if you've got certain populations of species that are doing absolutely fine in your sustainably managed agricultural areas, you may not necessarily need to establish new protected areas in order to provide high quality habitats for these species if they're already doing fine in the sustainably managed agricultural areas. And of course that will vary depending on species to species and how sensitive they are to different pressures and all that kind of stuff. Another really important thing is to account for complementarity is to use good algorithms. And this is this is where the word work tool comes in really well. So there's a range of different algorithms that have been developed to help people identify priority areas for conservation. You may be familiar with decision support tools such as Mark, Sand, Zonation, and Prioritizer. These all use these kinds of algorithms in order to help identify priority areas in a way that conforms to the principle of complementarity. So with zonation, that's on the far left, that uses your heuristic algorithms. These are basically like hill climbers. You start with a solution and then you iteratively tweak it a bit. And every time you tweak it, you're going to see, okay, does it make it better or does it make it worse? If it makes it better, we're going to accept it and then, tweak it again. And then we keep on tweaking it until we can't find any more tweaks that improve it. And then we stop, and that's our final solution. And that can be really good. Heuristic algorithms can run really quickly. They can handle very complex problems. They work very well with really, really large data sets. But they don't guarantee optimality. And what that means is, you can run it, once, twice, hundreds, thousands of times, but you're not necessarily going to know if you found a really good solution or not. So meta-heuristic algorithms are an improved version or a more complex version of heuristic algorithms. And they have this mechanism in them where they will accept bad tweaks if earlier on in the algorithm. And then towards the end, it's going to be less likely to accept bad tweaks. And right at the very end, it's only going to accept good changes. So what that means is sometimes when you're tweaking it, when you're running this algorithm and you're tweaking your solutions, you'll sometimes accept a change that actually makes it worse. And that's really helpful because that helps you get through those valleys. And then right at the end or towards the end, you're going to, you might make some changes and then you say, okay, well, this is a bad move. I'm not going to accept it this time because later on in the algorithm. And then, towards the end, you'll only be accepting the good moves. And that helps you like climb the hill right at the end. And that's what these kinds of algorithms do. So as you can see, they're really good because they can help you overcome some of the limitations of heuristic algorithms, because you can go through those valleys and climb those hills that may be beyond what the heuristic algorithm can find. But similar to the heuristic algorithms, you can run them, hundreds, thousands of times, but you won't necessarily know whether a better solution exists. And so this is why exact algorithms are really useful. These algorithms are guaranteed to provide optimal solutions or identify solutions that are near optimal. So you can be confident that when you use these algorithms that you're getting a good solution and you don't have to run it another 1,000 times in order to see whether a better one exists. And the way these algorithms work is they've got one component that tries to find better solutions and another component that tries to guess how good is, what's the value of the best possible solution. So how tall is the highest peak? And these basically run until they converge. And when they converge, then you know that the solution you've found with this bit here is, as good as the best, is equal to the best possible solution. And what's really useful is if you don't need an optimal solution, like maybe you only need something that's close to optimality, you can say, well, instead of stopping when they meet, let's stop when there's a small gap or a larger gap. But you can be confident that because you're saying stop when this gap is met, that you found a solution that's near optimal. And so these exact algorithms are the kind of algorithms that prioritize the users. And also the where to work tool, and they can be helpful for planning, I like to think. So I've talked a lot about the fundamental principles of conservation planning and how they relate to the Where to Work tool. The Where to Work tool brings all this together and supports the identification of priority areas of conservation. It allows you to set goals and targets interactively to help you explore trade-offs, and it's grounded in all these principles of systematic conservation planning that we talked about. So you can go from having data on where things are to priorities on where you need to act or where you implement management actions in order to meet certain objectives. So in the next session, we're going to go over how the Where to Work tool kind of works. We're going to go over some of the example kinds of data you would use with it. Thanks a lot for listening to me. My name is Jeff, but if you have any questions or you're interested in learning more about systematic conservation planning or the Where to Work tool, I suggest you talk to Richard Schuster, who works for the Nature Conservancy of Canada. And I've put various links on the slide as well. So the ncc.carleton.ca, that's the link to the Where to Work tool. And there's also the GitHub development page as well for the software. All right, thank you. Bye.